Hello and welcome to Please Expand. I'm Mahilius.
And I'm Julia.
Hi Julia, welcome back.
Thank you very much for having me again.
Are you excited about today's episode?
Yes, very much.
Well, today I'm interviewing John Ghazvinian, author of US-Iran, 1720 to the present.
Okay, maybe we can get the ball rolling by talking a bit more about who John is.
Yeah, so John is an American-Iranian author and historian. He is currently the executive director of the Middle East Center in the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he seems to be very busy with that. I follow him on Twitter. And in fact, he's always posting about some event or other that they're organizing. And it's always, generally has to do with Iran, but also just the Middle East in more general. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, he was moderating a conversation with the UN Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace.
And what is the book about?
So the book is about US-Iranian relations, but unlike most books that either begin from 1979, when the Iranian Revolution broke out, and you had the American hostage crisis, or from 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup against the democratically elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh, John begins his book from 1720, a very unlikely start date. And this just gives a whole different flavor to how we understand US-Iranian relations. For one, by not focusing on 79 or 53, we get a more balanced view, I would say, of their relationships. And for another, and this is John's central point, I think, we realize that these two nations were not always destined to be as antagonistic as they are nowadays, and that there were actually foundations for a more friendly relationship.
If I hadn't listened to the interview already, I would say that I look forward to knowing more about this. But I actually did have a preview. So definitely one recurring theme is the fascination that Americans felt towards Iran around the 1720s. What do you take the other main themes to be?
So, yeah, we're going to talk about how Iran looked to America in the 19th century as a potential ally to help them against the expansionist ambitions of Britain and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
How religion, and I found this very fascinating, how religion actually acts as a catalyst for change rather than a bulwark of conservatism. And how, according to different needs, the double identity that Iran can sort of play with as either ancient Persia or Muslim Iran was emphasized, and how that led down to different and often fascinating roads.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, as far as I understood, though the book is about the relationships between the US and Iran, really is also a book about how we can understand better this double nature of Iran, which comes across as an extremely complex
Definitely, yeah.
country.
As you said, the book is as much a book about US-Iranian relations as it is about how Iran has seen itself over the 280 odd years that the book covers.
Yeah, and so coming back to the role I play, I look forward to listening to the rest of the interview, Achille. And
And yes, after the interview, be sure to stick around for me and Julia, who will be discussing some of the key points from the interview. And for now, I give you John Ghazvinian and US-Iran. Hello and welcome to Please Expand. I'm Ahilius Rockney, and today I'm very happy to have with me on the podcast John Ghazvinian, author of American-Iran, A History 1720 to the Present. John, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the reason why I picked up your book was because I was intrigued by the really broad scope that you take. Instead of telling the story of US-Iranian relations from 1753 or 79, you start all the way back from 1720. And one immediately thinks, what on earth were they possibly getting up to back then? And it was actually quite a bit. So before we get into discussing what these two nations actually thought about each other, perhaps you could tell us a bit about the motivation behind this approach. Why did you write this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And there were a few things I was trying to do a little bit differently, because I know that the history of US-Iran relations is certainly not an original topic, certainly not something that nobody's ever talked about, and something that, this is not going to be the last book that's ever written about it. But I think what I was trying to do a little bit differently was get us away from some of these, some of these blame game narratives, right? When we think about US-Iran relations, we tend to focus on what's gone wrong, everything that's gone wrong, why things are so bad. And, and I think that embedded in that question is this implication that it's somebody's fault and that we have to find the victim and the oppressor and the perpetrator and the criminal and the, who started it, those kinds of questions. That's not a very useful way of approaching history, but when you do approach history that way, you tend to focus on things like 1979 and 1953. 1979 being, of course, the year of the Iranian Revolution, when radicalized Iranian students took the American embassy and took its employees hostage for over a year. And then, of course, the relations between the two countries were broken off in the midst of that. 1953, of course, is the year of the CIA-backed coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran that helped to cement the rule of the Shah, the king, who eventually became much more dictatorial in his rule and arguably caused blowback in the form of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I think these are canonical dates. Depending on whether you want to blame America or blame Iran, you tend to emphasize one or the other of these, right? Everything was fine until the Iranians took the embassy hostage. Everything was fine until the US overthrew the legitimate government of Iran in 1953. Those are all reasonable ways to approach it, but the problem with that is you're focusing on where the problems began instead of focusing on the longer history of where things maybe haven't always been so bad. Because I think when you're asking, well, where did things go wrong? The implication is maybe things went right at some point. So that was what I was more interested in trying to find out, is what the deep history was. And lo and behold, turns out that over the 200, even arguably 300 years, these are two civilizations that have had a very long history of mutual warmth, admiration, idealization, fascination, contact, relationships. And the last 40 years of hostility is not what characterizes the entire relationship. So let's try to ask ourselves why or how things went right in the first place, if they ever did, if there ever was a sort of golden age of US-Iran relations. I would argue that maybe not. So why 1720? Well, it turns out that, so for me, it was a question of where do you begin then, if not 79 or 53, You could begin in 1940 or 42. Before that, the US is a very isolationist power. And it's in the early 1940s that the US begins to send advisory missions to Iran and really seriously starts to engage with Iran. Before that, the US is not interested in Iran or the Middle East particularly. So naturally, a lot of American historians have not bothered to look at the pre-1940 period. But I think that's a problem in its own way, because that's saying basically this relationship is only important when the US becomes interested. And it neglects the fact that actually for 80 years before that, the Iranian government, successive Iranian governments, were very interested in getting the US more invested in their affairs. So maybe you begin with the first diplomatic relations in the 1850s, first exchanges of diplomats in the 1880s. That's all reasonable, but why only privilege the diplomatic, political narrative? What about people-to-people contact, which begins much earlier in the 1830s with American Presbyterian missionaries going over to Iran? I wanted to do something even more eccentric, which was to begin with the prehistory, the preconceived notions that these two civilizations had of each other before they came into contact, before the US even existed as a country, as a republic. And I was surprised to find that in the 1720s, North American colonial newspapers were absolutely fascinated with Iran. So that's where I wanted to begin.
And that definitely adds a new perspective to when we think about US-Iranian relations. Let's just start a bit with this first contact, 1720 newspaper, where they're essentially talking about Iran's war with this Sunni power, which Iran is a Shia Islam country, and people are sort of thinking about this war as some kind of proxy war with the Ottomans, who are sort of the boogeyman of Europe. Something that seemed to be a theme of your whole book was the distinction between Iran as Persia and Iran as an Islamic country. In this initial stage, in 1720, the people seem to be Americans, or the people living in America now, seem to be emphasizing the Persian aspect of Iran. They don't seem to be thinking of it as Iran as this Muslim country. Firstly, do you think that's right? And
I think it's a little more complex than that, but yes, sure. There are multiple identities that are intersecting at different points. I think they were, but I think broadly speaking, that's correct. Yes. And yeah, I was fascinated by this. I mean, they were obsessed with Iran, with Persia, as they called it. 20-30% of the newspapers sometimes were consumed with news from Iran. I even came across one newspaper that said, "Oh, we regret that we have no news from Persia this week." In 1724 in Philadelphia, it was front page news story was that we have no news from Iran this week. And I thought, why are they so obsessed with Iran? And not only that, but they're very, very, very vocally pro-Iranian. And it was exactly what you're talking about. They were there's some sense of Persia as the lesser of two evils in the Middle East. They didn't call it the Middle East at the time, but in the Orient and the East, because they hated the Ottoman Empire so much. The evil Turk, the terrible Turk. There had been centuries of crusades between Christian Europeans and Seljuk Turks and Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans were seen as being in possession of the Holy Land. They were seen as having threatened Christian Europe. And remember that for white colonial settlers in North America in the 1720s, they saw themselves as Europeans, as Christian, as British subjects. It just happened to be, in a far-flung part of the world, but they still saw the Ottoman Empire as the great evil threat to Christian civilization. So they liked the idea that the Persians were their arch rivals. They were seen as a little bit less Muslim, a bit less evil. They liked that they were Shia, and they liked the fact that the predominant Sunni, saw the minority Shia as being heretics. They said, that's a good thing. We like that. They're not real Muslims. They're not as bad as the Turks. Saw a newspaper that came across a newspaper that described this rivalry as being a rivalry between, quote, Persians and Muslims.
Right. Okay.
Persians and Muslims, as if somehow Persians are not Muslims, right? So that speaks to some of what you're talking about, and that was actually fascinating. But I think a lot of that lasts well into the 1970s in the United States, and this is why I began the book where I did, because there is this idealization of this kind of fantasy land to the east of the Ottoman Empire. I call my opening chapter East of Eden, because that's how they saw it. They saw the Garden of Eden as being in the easternmost fringes of the Ottoman Empire, and Persia began just to the east of that. And it was less threatening. It wasn't an occupation of the holy sites. It wasn't threatening Europe. And it was sort of a fairy tale land. And they liked that. And I think that, that you fast forward 100 years to the first American Presbyterian missionaries who arrive in Iran, and they use a lot of the same language. They describe it as Edenic, as a paradise, and even in the 1970s, most Americans, when they looked at the Middle East, would have seen it as something they didn't like. But what they didn't like were the Arab states, the socialist Ba'athist states, the wars with Israel that the Arab states were fighting, the oil embargo, things like that, Nasserism. But when they looked further east, once again, they saw this kind of fantasy land led by this very benevolent, pro-American emperor, with his beautiful, glamorous wife and these kind of, crowns full of jewels and, all this kind of stuff, these elaborate coronation ceremonies. And it's like Napoleon and Josephine and whatever. And they didn't see this kind of evil, Muslim, kind of angry part of the Middle East. Now, that changed, of course, after 1979. This was the fantasy that Americans had about Iran. And Iranians had their own fantasy about America until 1953.
So before we get to that, sticking to the 19th century for now, as you said already, America is not that interested in Iran. Iran is a bit more interested in America, much more interested in America. And the context for this is the growing power of Imperial Britain and Imperial Russia, and the forces they're exerting on the south and the north of Iran. And you talk about this concept of the United States as a third power, as a powerful nation that can somehow mediate or perhaps even offer a way out for Iran in this little sandwich that it is, this imperial sandwich. Could you say a bit about this third power and maybe its legacy?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I think something a lot of people don't realize is that from the 1850s until the 1940s, this was a critical part of Iranian foreign policy for almost a century, developing a third force to balance out the pressures that they were feeling from the Russians in the north and the Caspian and the British Empire in the south and the Persian Gulf. And one of the countries they consistently looked to was the United States as a potential third force. They saw the US as a more benevolent power, an anti-imperialist power. What they didn't know much about America, but they also had a fantasy about America. Their fantasy was, well, U.S. had come to power in a revolution against the British Empire 100 years earlier, and it didn't seem to want to interfere in the affairs of smaller, weaker countries, unlike the imperialist powers of Europe. There were Americans living in Iran, building schools and clinics and Presbyterian missionaries and things like that. But the government had no embassy, had no diplomats. They thought that's pretty cool. They don't seem to want to bother us. They're like a more benevolent version of the West. And, it's interesting because the very first disagreement that Iran and America ever had was in the 1850s when they were trying to do their very first treaty of friendship. And one of the many sticking points was that the Iranian government wanted to buy warships, American-made warships, flying the Stars and Stripes and manned by American sailors to sail in the Persian Gulf under the auspices of the Persian Navy to send a message to the British that, we have this new American ally. And the United States understandably said, no, we don't want to get involved in this. It's none of our business. It took them 5 years to negotiate this treaty, longer than it took them to negotiate the nuclear deal in 2015, because Iran was saying, we want you more involved in our business, and the US was saying, no, we don't want to get involved in your business. That's the first disagreement these two countries ever had. And I think that's fascinating, because it couldn't be more different, of course, from the reality that we're faced with today. And it wasn't really that long ago.
Yeah. If I could invite you to speculate a bit, do you think there is a realistic scenario where America could have gotten involved with Iranian politics in the 1850s and done something?
That's a great question. Realistic? Yes, they could have, but it would have gone completely against the entire consensus around foreign policy in the United States at the time. There was a widespread feeling that the U.S. should not become involved in entangling alliances in parts of the world where it has no special interests. And the Middle East was very much one of those places. It was Persia was just, people didn't know anything. Even in the 1850s in America, no one really knew anything about Iran other than, what they'd read in the Bible about Persia and Cyrus and, the three wise men from the East and things like that. And the Persian Empire, to some degree, the ancient Persian Empire. They had very little understanding of the realities of modern Iran or of the Persian Gulf or the Middle East. It would have been strange for them to get involved. Not unrealistic, just strange. And incongruent, I guess, with the philosophy of American foreign policy at the time.
Right, it would have entangled them possibly in a very costly foreign war as well with Britain.
In a very, 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 very far off part of the world. Remember, it took 2 months to get from New York to Tehran. In the 1850s, 1860s, 2 months with the wind at your back. You'd have to sail to Europe, maybe sail down through the Mediterranean to Istanbul, or travel by land or train, depending, across Europe to Istanbul, and then undertake a very difficult land journey across Anatolia and over the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, across into northwest Iran, and then another couple hundred miles to Tehran, or take a steamship to Batum across the Black Sea, and then cross over the Caucasus and land, in the Caspian, somewhere around Rasht, and then make your way to, hugely difficult journey. And we forget that. This was a pretty far-flung part of the world. For the U.S. to get deeply involved in this part of the world would have made no real sense. Oil was not an interest. We forget, the United States was actually sending oil to Iran as late as 1910. So, the idea that this was a sort of lucrative natural resource as well was not of interest.
And in this period, Iran is ruled by the Qajar dynasty, and you give a very, very bleak picture of their rule. They're all quite corrupt and ineffective rulers, to put it nicely. And then in 1906, after about 80 years of humiliating treaties with foreign powers, poor ruling, you've got this revolution, you've got this constitutional revolution, and you've got the as you say, the creation of the first Muslim democracy, the Majlis. What I found striking about this, and you see this again in 1979, and you talk about this in your book, is the role of Islam, the role of religion, really, in driving revolutionary desire, in driving the desire for change. In Europe, we're very much used to the idea of church and crown. The church will support the crown and vice versa. So I just have just a couple of questions, really. What do you think there is something specific about Iran or Shia Islam that makes it anti-monarchic, pro-democracy, or is it just something that happened in that time? Was it just a confluence of things that just gave rise to this thing that we're not really used to in Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a little bit of both. I mean, and I don't want to get into this kind of very essentialist kind of view of Shia Islam that kind of explains everything, explains Iran. But no, it is relevant. I mean, what distinguishes Shia Muslims from Sunni Muslims, of course, is that the Shia don't believe in the concept of a caliph, don't believe in the concept, actually, the purest expressions of kind of Shia Muslim philosophy don't really like the idea of a monarch or temporal ruler that kind of makes all the decisions. The idea is that everyone's kind of mainstream, quote unquote, 12er Shia Islam. The idea is everybody's waiting for the 12th Imam, for the hidden Imam, to come back from occultation, the Mahdi. And so therefore our real obligation on earth is simply to live the most moral life possible, in preparation for the return of the Imam. So you could sort of see why that might lend itself well to a political philosophy that doesn't particularly love the idea of monarchy. Now, does that explain the constitutional revolution in Iran? No, of course not. There's much more to it than that. It was also, there were a lot of other factors, but it wasn't difficult. And it hasn't been difficult in the last 100 years for Shia Muslim clerics to present themselves as defenders of the oppressed, as a sort of liberationist force even. But a lot of that comes much later from Ali Shariati in the 1960s and 70s and later Khomeini, because it elides with third worldist liberation movements in a way that I think is much more similar to liberation theology in Central America, for example. Right. Kind of Catholic priests, leftist priests, things like that. So it's not unheard of, but but you're right. I mean, typically the way we learn history traditionally is that the state, the church is on the side of the state, on the side of reaction, on the side of conservatism, and it was actually that way for a lot of Iranian history as well, really until Khomeini. Well, I mean, it's true in the Mashruteh that in the constitutional revolution of 1906 that you do get some of these clerics who are revolutionaries to some degree or another, but they're not fire-breathing, turn down the whole system kind of revolutionaries. They're concerned about the rights of the clerics. They're concerned about too much autocracy. They're concerned, frankly, about the country giving away too many rights and privileges to foreign powers without consulting to the stakeholders. And that looks very different in the 1960s when Ayatollah Khomeini makes a fundamentally different kind of argument, which is to say that monarchy is simply not accepted in the eyes of God, that it's not an Islamic concept. It's much further than any of the clerics in the 1906 revolution would have gone. But
just a question on the relationship between religion and monarchy in the 19th century. How did the Shahs view themselves? Were they, because they've got this whole mythology of being this lineage of kings that stretches all the way back from Cyrus. So this is sort of the Persian lineage. This is the Persian culture that sort of grounds them. But they're also Muslim kings. How are they, I don't know how quite to put it, their personality, how are they ruling? Are they ruling with an emphasis on the Persian side or on the Muslim side? Maybe it doesn't make sense to put it that way.
Sure, no, I mean, a little bit of both and a little bit of neither, honestly. Kingship in the Qajar, and this is not my area of expertise, by the way, but kingship in the Qajar era is different from kingship in the Pahlavi era, and different from kingship in the Safavid era. It's to some extent Iran is still a very sort of tribal society in the 19th century. It's not a highly centralized state. So this idea of Persian nationalism is something that we tend to read backwards into Qajar history that isn't always actually relevant. But they also aren't, they have a lot of the rhetoric of, I mean, the Muslim, even the sort of the religious side of things is not everything either. It's not like they're I mean, sure, it's part of the rhetoric, the Zillullah, the shadow of God on earth. But, they're largely sort of primus inter pares kind of among tribal chiefs, right? Kind of pulling together the various disparate elements of the societies of the Iranian plateau. It's a loose and relatively weak monarchy, actually, in the 19th century, although with a lot of the trappings of power.
Yeah. You made that abundantly clear. So Just to continue with this theme a bit, and moving a bit forward to the sort of the new dynasty of Reza Shah Pahlavi, you briefly mentioned him, a military man. He starts a new dynasty in 1925. Well, the government, the Majlis, appoint him Shah, and he's fascinating for a whole bunch of reasons. But just focusing on this Iran as Persia, Iran as Shia Islam, that tension really seems to surface with his reign, where he really identifies Islam as backward and sort of unable to assimilate into the modern world. And he wants to really emphasize, ironically, the really ancient antiquity past of Iran. Do you think, because he introduces some really radical reforms or laws against Islam, what kind of impact do you think that had on Iranian society leading up to the 1979 revolution?
I think this is absolutely critical to understanding the 1979 revolution. And that's not to heap blame on Reza Shah. He was a product of his time. Things like fascism, these are 1930s political philosophies are very difficult to talk about today because we tend to very quickly associate them in our minds with some of the darkest moments of modern world history. And kind of Nazis and the Second World War and so on. But we forget that we're doing that with the benefit of hindsight. In the 1920s and 1930s, these kinds of political philosophies were very, very common in many parts of the world, including in the US as well, in the UK, although it didn't take hold quite as strongly in the US and in the UK as it did in, for example, Spain or Italy or Germany or other places. But this idea of a kind of looking backward to look forward, right? A kind of fascist ideology that progress and modernity will emerge from the very blood and soil of the people, from some kind of deep, deep ancient soul, right? That's been buried by the evils of XYZ, whether it's, Jews or Arabs or other kinds of, easily scapegoated groups or foreign actors, whatever it might be, is something that is common. You see some version of it in almost every country in the years between the wars, especially countries that have been weakened or weakened by outside states, where there is a sense that the country is missing its national backbone. And even in countries like Iran, where, there's an appeal to almost a mythical past that, may or may not have existed. I mean, Reza Shah comes along in the 1920s and says, we need to stand up for ourselves and be proud of ourselves as an Iranian nation. Well, what he's talking about is something that might have been unrecognizable 50, 60 years earlier to the Qajars, who barely thought of themselves as leading a kind of modern nation state. But it doesn't matter. By that point, Iran, the borders are settled, and there's a feeling that, well, we need to come together and pull together and as a modern nation. And how do we do that? The appeal to religion doesn't make as much sense to someone like Reza Shah, because that is giving a lot of power to the established clergy, the ulama, who already have a lot of power. If he's trying to create his own power base and try to show how modern he is, how much he's like the West, how much he's like Europe, he's going to tap into a different strain of Iranian pride. And it's the same strain of pride that Mussolini is tapping into in Italy, that Franco is tapping into in Spain, that the Nazis are tapping into in Germany. It's some kind of presumed mythical, lost to the mists of time kind of past of this ancient, proud people that have been polluted and taken advantage of and manipulated by external powers and so on. And it makes sense that he's tapping into some of this Aryan ideology that scapegoats Arabs and what are Arabs associated with Islam, and so it's kind of like, well, this is what made us weak. Now, I want to emphasize, he's not a secular leader. He's a Muslim. He's not saying we need to reject Islam, just saying that, Islam has no place in government, and Islam is not the path to modernity and progress. Now, a lot of people today like to idealize Reza Shah, especially in contrast to the Islamic Republic, and say, oh, he had the right idea. But it's worth remembering that, first of all, it was a product of his time, and secondly, that he was a tremendously dictatorial figure in his own right, brutal dictator by today's standards, killed a lot of his own people, traumatized people, including women, by forcing veils off their heads and so on, to quote, make them modern. And it's also worth remembering, like I said, he's a product of his time. In the 1920s and 30s, it seems like secularism, secular fascism is the answer, is the way forward. Mm-hmm. When that fails across the Middle East, and socialism and all these kinds of ideas, there is a turn in the 1970s away from all of that, a tendency to say, socialism fascism, any of these kinds of, ideas. These are all basically Western European imported ideas. We need to turn to our own, what we lost track of our own authentic native strength. And what is that? It's Islam. And suddenly there's a turn towards Islam, not just in Iran, but throughout the region. And that's where political Islam really starts to take off in Iran and throughout the Middle East. And so Khomeini rides that wave, and he's very much a product of his time as well. So it's not, I think we have to be careful about reading backwards our own value judgments into all of these things, but,
Definitely. Before we get to 1979, I'd just like to look a bit at the period from 1941 to 79, where Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is in power. Really just looking after the 1953 coup. And just to look at the American perspective now, because America is becoming a bit more of a prominent actor in this relationship. And a recurring theme with the American presidents, perhaps with the exception of Jimmy Carter to a certain extent, is this really just this classic tale of fear of communism. It's this idea that everything that America does, all its foreign policy decisions, are because it's afraid of a country becoming communist. How much do you think this is the case when we're trying to explain America's attitude and their relationship towards Mohammad Reza Pahlavi?
Definitely. The Cold War is so important. It absolutely dominates American thinking, right down to the end of the Pahlavi state. I mean, it's extraordinary. In the midst of the revolution, the Carter administration is completely bemused. They have no idea what they're doing because they cannot conceive of this idea of religious revolution. It's not in the playbook. It's simply not in the playbook. No one saw it coming. The Americans are not unique in this way. There's this, and it's hard for us to understand today, but there was this assumption that there must be a communist under every Ayatollah's turban. They couldn't, the Soviets are somehow provoking this. And then when they realize that the Soviets are not provoking it, there's this feeling of, well, maybe we need to start talking to these revolutionaries because obviously the Ayatollah is not going to run the country because, he's just a cleric. And they don't realize that actually that's exactly what's going to happen. The power of religion in that moment, things were changing. The Cold War was coming to an end in some ways, even before it had come to an end. It was other types of ideologies were emerging that rejected all of these materialist philosophies. And you look at the writings of some of the Iranian revolutionaries, it's really striking how much they look at East and West. And, remember, there's that famous slogan in the Iranian Revolution, Na Sharqi, Na Gharbi, Jumhuriya Islami. And I say it in Persian because it rhymes well in Persian. It doesn't sound good in English because it's often translated as neither East nor West, Islamic Republic, which sounds pretty anemic. But the point of that is, a pox on both your houses. This idea that we're having this debate between socialism and capitalism, between communism and kind of free market liberalism. These are all materialist philosophies. The idea is they're all focused on how to improve the material wealth of people while they're on this earth. No one's looking at their spiritual existence. That sounds crazy, but that was something that economists and political scientists and officials, foreign policy makers weren't thinking about. They were thinking about, we're going to appeal to the third world, quote unquote, by showing how our ideology will make their lives better than the other side's ideology. But no one was really thinking about, well, maybe there are people in the third world who actually want to have some of their own ideas. And in Iran, at least, this is the direction it went.
Yeah, and that ends up playing a pretty decisive role in the war as well with Iraq. Your description of the way Iran sort of unified and mobilized against this external threat was very bound up with this, as you say, the spiritual idea of a unified Islamic nation. How important do you think it is that this country was unified under this spiritual, religious idea for its resilience during that war, which it could have very easily lost?
It's a very good question. It depends on who you talk to. People who write the history of the Islamic Republic today in the Islamic Republic, and on behalf of the Islamic Republic, that's what they would say. But I actually think that there was a lot of just straightforward nationalist feeling in the Iran-Iraq war. A lot of people, look, clearly religion played a very important role in motivating huge numbers of especially young boys to volunteer and run away to the trenches and give up their lives in a human wave attacks. You're not going to get people doing that without some. Well, you could actually, but probably not without at least some modicum of religion involved. That kind of martyrdom. Although, as I'm saying that, I think there are examples of kind of secular martyrdom as well. I mean, talk about Japanese kamikaze bombers and whatever. But I think that clearly played a role into it. In it, but I think also the general public support for the war, which did exist for most of the war, particularly in the early days in places like Tehran, was not motivated exclusively by religion. I think there was a feeling of being attacked, being on their own. Iran was very much on its own, still is very much on its own, and has been since the Islamic Republic. And that does something to the psyche of a nation. I think it's something much deeper than just religion. I think it's a sense of being resilient, of being resistant, of being isolated, of being attacked, of being victimized, rightly or wrongly. I mean, this is just the narrative. I cast no value judgment on any of it, but this is the feeling, right? And maybe that's changing to some extent these days, but that has defined a lot of the history of the Islamic Republic.
So from 53 to 79, America and Iran are sort of best buddies. After the revolution, there is a sort of a new player, and that is the State of Israel. And this occupies a large part of the book. And I'm very interested to explore just to what extent, well, firstly, the reasons that you give for why Israel is concerned about Iran being friendly with America. And secondly, to what extent it is Israel that acts as the obstacle to friendship between the two nations.
Yeah, this is often very poorly understood as well, because Israel hasn't always been so opposed to the Islamic Republic. In the 1980s, they were the ones pushing the Reagan administration to actually improve relations with Iran, helping the Reagan administration to sell weapons to Iran, and advocating for the idea that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were the bigger threat. That changed after the end of the Cold War. It changed with the beginning of the Arab-Israeli peace process, where hatred of Iran became a natural kind of glue between Israel and some of these so-called moderate Arab states, by which we really mean sort of pro-American Arab states. And that's kind of where we've been for the last 30 years. And that's when Israel really changed its tune and has been advocating very strongly for, or rather against, any kind of rapprochement between the US and Iran. And I outline in the book just how effectively they've done that, actually. And the Israelis not alone. The Gulf Arab states especially have played a large role in this, but it is, I think, very clear, if you're looking closely, at just how quick and how keen Israel is to introduce problems every time it looks like the US and Iran might be about to improve relations, including most recently the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the nuclear scientist, just a few months ago, when just before Biden took office, when they knew that it would make it difficult for the Biden administration to revive the nuclear deal with Iran.
Yeah. And what do you think is the future of US-Iranian relationships? Does it look positive?
Very hard to say. No, I don't think. I'm not very optimistic. I'm very idealistic. I believe that these are two countries that should actually have better relations, have no real reason not to, actually. But I'm not very optimistic. Nothing. There seems to be no move for a whole lot of reasons of their own. These are both countries that I think have largely given up on the idea of each other. It's become that the enmity has become really ossified. And China's the new game in town, for both countries. In different ways. Iran has just concluded that, rightly or wrongly, they've concluded that there's no trusting the US, that you can, pull out all the stops and do this nuclear deal with America, and then they'll just pull out. And what's the point of trying to get sanctions repealed if they're just going to get reimposed? Let's just turn to the future, which is China, and stand on our own feet a little bit and try to work with the Chinese and others. And then the US, of course, is fixated with East Asia for its own reasons. It's very concerned about China as a rival, and is doing everything it can to just not get any more bogged down in the Middle East than it already is. So, there's not a lot of political will or energy in either country to sort of renew the nuclear deal, to seriously change the tone of relations. It's just going to be kind of, I think we're in for a long period of just kind of steady as she goes, and a long kind of frosty relationship between the two countries.
I see. Okay. So just one final question. I ask this to everyone that I interview. What are your future plans? What are you planning on working on?
More books about this. This book was originally twice the length when I know it's a very long book. It's about close to 600 pages, but it was around 1,300 pages in its first draft. So there's plenty more material. particularly for some of the early years that I'd like to spin out. Some stuff on the nuclear deal maybe as well. I don't know. Possibly some other book ideas as well that I have. I got a lot of different ideas. I'm just trying to think about the next thing. But I am keeping very busy with my day job, which is running the Middle East Center here at the University of Pennsylvania.
Right. Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time, John. And I greatly enjoyed your book. Great read.
My pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Hello and welcome back.
Hello again.
So this is the post-interview reflections part of the podcast, and Julia and I will chat a bit about what we found most interesting in my interview with John. So Julia, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so thank you very much for picking this book, actually, because I found it extremely rich and fascinating, and I look forward to reading it. Something that definitely stuck with me is his treatment of identity making and identity in general, because he seems to give this picture whereby what's really important to nations is to have a strong identity, which is not controversial per se, but it seems like this having an identity is much more important than having a specific identity. Nationalism is important, but it looks different in different phases of history, you know.
Yeah.
So it happens that Iran has, for political and geopolitical and historical reasons, has to differentiate itself from other Islamic countries, then the Persian nature comes out. Whereas when it has to take distance from the West, it stresses the Islamic nature. So I was wondering, is it that easy to mold one's identity by contrast, according to what we need, or is it simply that Iran has a very complex pool of features from which it can pick?
So I think definitely what's interesting about Iran is because of their situation, their historical situation, their political situation, their identity making is always in opposition to something. It's very combative.
Well, perhaps something similar could be said about every country. The characteristic thing about Iran is that it has two kinds of opponents. So, because I was thinking, well, also France had to identify, to build its own identity by contrasting itself to, I don't know, England. But the fact that France doesn't have another kind of opponent didn't make it necessary for them to develop a second soul. Whereas the international relationship that Iran had with, in this case, the US on the one side and other Islamic countries on the other side, prompted it to develop two souls.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm not sure develop is the right word. I guess make use of.
Yeah.
Right, because they're always there.
That's very true.
It's all about how they implement them. I mean, now that you just mentioned France, and maybe that's an interesting example. Maybe we're being a bit too. Maybe we're not considering enough other elements. For example, I've often heard that in the early 19th century, when Napoleon sort of comes to France or takes charge of France, that he sort of emphasizes France's Roman lineage, the Roman background, and the sort of evocation of that Roman connection that France has. And I wonder if this is something that actually many nations do.
Yeah.
There's this shadowy, pristine, antique past which can be called upon in times of change, when you want to change things.
Italy notoriously made use of that.
Right.
During fascism, at least.
But I guess what's interesting about Iran, though, in contrast to France, let's say, is, and it's just pure speculation, I'm not at all an expert, France seems that a lot of European countries can share in this ancient Roman past. A lot of them can evoke it, or maybe even an ancient Greek past. Whereas Iran seems to stand out from its neighbors by being the only one that can invoke this ancient Persian past. They stand out in being ancient Persian, or having this ancient Persian lineage that other neighboring countries can't draw on. I wonder if that has a certain effect of making you feel more unique, or of making it a more distinguishing feature than just the evocation of ancient Rome in Europe, for example.
Yeah, that's very fascinating, though it seems to me that you are adopting a very essentialist perspective, in a way, as if a country is what it is.
Yeah.
Whereas John seems to stress this identity-making process, which then raises a few questions. First of all, who makes it? And second of all, I don't know, who approves it? And third of all, how arbitrary it is, and perhaps also how practically minded of a process
Yeah.
it is.
I definitely think that it's a dynamic process, right? It's not as if a leader decides and then everyone becomes that thing. And it's not as if what everyone wants to be is just what the nation is. It seems to be much more of a dynamic interplay of forces.
Yeah, well, definitely you should put a book on populism in the list, so that we, because I suppose that is really similar, like that the kind of narrative you adopt really affects your identity. Though of course Iran's drawing on the Persian history is extremely more essential.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a leader would be very unsuccessful if they tried to assert an identity that no one could identify with. So there does seem to be a certain boundary to what you can reasonably assert, though I guess within that boundary people will disagree about it. What's interesting about, for example, the rule of Reza Shah, the first of the Pahlavi dynasty, is that in his attempts to modernize, he made certain religious elements of society not necessary. And that had a negative effect with large portions of society who saw religion and I guess the moral precepts that come with it as essential to the identity of the nation. And so that's an interesting example of someone, Reza Shah in this case, emphasizing an aspect of society, of the nation, in a practical effort to get something, to modernize, to westernize, as he saw it, and in the process alienating himself from certain portions of the population.
And this point also connects to something else we were talking about the other day, that had to do with the role of religion, because you were telling me that something that you learned from this book is that religion was a progressive force in Iran at several points. So once again, it seems that there are these ideas of religion or Islam or identity. They're very empty in and by itself, and then they can be filled in different ways.
Yeah. Maybe one of the harder questions I asked John, or maybe the stupidest one, was whether he thought there was anything particular about the Iranian brand of Islam.
Yeah, what were you thinking
that makes it particularly democratic? Well, I was just really, I have to say, I was really surprised. In growing up in Europe, you read about how religion is a limiting force. It's a force of conservatism. It's a force that prevents development. And opposed to religion, we have the Enlightenment. We have new science, all these things of progression. And then you read this book, and you read about the Constitutional Revolution in the early 1900s, the date escapes me right now, and the revolution in 1979. And these are all motors of change. And they're not sort of like top-down motors of change, as you might, as let's say the Inquisition was in Europe, or the Protestant Reformation was. But they're ground up, they're grassroots moments of motors of change. And so what I was wondering was, are there certain ideological aspects to the Iranian brand of Shia Islam
that makes it particularly amenable to democracy, to progress, to something like this?
I mean, seeing how things went afterwards, probably not.
Right. I mean, I guess. Oh yeah, that's a very interesting question to ask as well, because
Whether
obviously
it's the same religion.
Yeah, or maybe maybe also within that there is a limit to how far it will go, to how much it will give you. Maybe it was very successful in establishing parliamentarian rule and to limiting monarchical power, and maybe it was very successful to pushing out American influence in Iran and giving control, maybe in scare quotes, I don't know to what extent that's true, back to Iranians. But maybe it's not sufficient to the present aspirations of many Iranians.
Yeah.
So,
I think it would be interesting to, especially with what's happening now in Iran, I would like to know more about, from this progressive force, it ended up being such an obscurantist and dictatorial force, and whether all the explanation can be found in the nature of religion, or whether the real explanation has to do with human corruption and thirst for power.
This is something that we didn't really get to in the interview. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. But he does talk a lot about another leader. His name escapes me again. But he was a very a liberal theocrat in this case. And he was very much in favor of certain policies that would be considered liberal, whilst also maintaining the Islamic aspect of Iran. So I suspect it does have to do with a certain branch of clericalism taking control in the country, over possibly another branch. Maybe there is an alternative scenario where Iran remains a theocracy, but is slightly more progressive.
I think that from all this we can draw the lesson that this book is really not so much about ideals and conceptual truths as much as embodied phenomena.
Definitely.
And
it definitely muddies the waters. It definitely makes things very complicated.
And another way in which we can see that this is the direction it takes is that it's a book about the goodness of the relationships between Iran and the US, but it's not the kind of metaphysical goodness, right?
Right. Yeah. It's the goodness of international politics, of alliances, of convenience. And in fact, I thought this was something that maybe the book doesn't really succeed in doing. So I mentioned in the introduction, and in the interview as well, that one of the aims of the book is that by giving such a broad scope on US-Iranian relations, that we'll see that they weren't always bad, that they didn't always hate each other, and that things didn't have to be this bad, or as bad as they are now. But as I was reading the book, I didn't really get that impression, because either it's the 19th century and a bit of the 20th century where Iran is desperately trying to get America involved in its affairs, and America has no interest in Iran. Sure, okay, they have a nice opinion of them. They see Iran as the seat of ancient Persia, of culture, civilization, and the Iranians see America as this democratic beacon of a society that they could aspire to be. Okay, these are all goodwill, but they're not necessarily good relations, or at least international relations. There's no active cooperation or assistance. And then in 1953, you've got the CIA coup, and you've got effectively 30 years of American sort of puppeteering, let's say, in Iran. And so you either have, on the one hand, Iran desperately trying to be friends with America and America not being interested, or America being too interested and Iran wanting them to stop being interested.
But once again, my friend, maybe you're falling into the essentialist trap, and maybe that is exactly what goodness in international relationships means.
Well, indeed, yeah. I guess it's just that, let's just say that there isn't a model of bilateral relations. Like,
that they never relate to
see.
each other as equals, let's say, as the way as, let's say, England and America do. Maybe not that much. I don't know. Maybe England and France.
Like cat and mouse.
It's a bit like cat and mouse, yeah. And I think, if anything, his book highlights perhaps the inherent geopolitical limitations to friendship. I'm not sure. But if anything, it definitely doesn't tell us that... Though, let's just say there isn't a moment in history where they were best friends.
And they both thought that the other one
was inherently useful in some way. I mean, even in this practical realpolitik dimension of being able to get something out of the other, there's never a situation where they can both mutually get something out of each other, the way you would think of a classic alliance.
Yeah. So, if this is true, it is definitely one of the desideratum of the book is not fully met then, because it is presented as a book on good relationships.
Right. But on the other hand, he is right that his book does show that the relationships were not always flag burning, Iranians burning the American flag.
Well, though maybe this is also because the US has not always been the US that we know now. Like something that actually I found surprising, and then I was embarrassed by finding it surprising because it meant that I didn't know that already, is that the US was not an imperialist force for a very long time. Like it's kind of recent in its history. He was talking of how it was perceived as a third power between Russia and Britain. So perhaps that they were good relationships also because the US was not this exporter of democracy that it is now.
That's definitely true. And it's no coincidence that the 1953 coup happens in an age where American isolationism has finished because of World War II. And they're much more concerned about the Cold War and about, they've got the whole policy of containment, of containing the spread of communism. So definitely the two things must go together. And, in his book, he makes a big deal of the Cold War and how the Cold War is fundamental to understanding US-Iranian relationships from the 50s onwards.
Well, and also at the time, as I learned, no one would have ever imagined that religion could have been a threat.
Right.
Which, again, is hard to think about, but not hard to think about just because nowadays, in recent history, it has been a threat or perceived as such, but also, in ancient times it was, and in so many times it was that it's quite naive of them not to see that coming at all.
Yeah, it's very interesting that intelligence agencies just did not believe that people would do these things in the name of religion.
Yeah.
They just, it didn't enter their horizon of possibility.
Yeah, that's...
And it completely caught them off guard when it happened. One thing that the book definitely does show is the incompetence of American intelligence in Iran. They really had no idea what was going on.
Okay.
Which says a lot, I suppose, about their relations again.
Or about the subtlety of Iranians.
Indeed, yes, they're very subtle. Well, thank you very much, Julia. This was fascinating to talk about.
Thank you very much for picking this book. Again, it was very one to hear about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for listening today. Please do check out my website, www.pleaseexpand.com, where you can find all information about authors and books and upcoming episodes. You can also subscribe there. Please do follow me on whatever platform you use. It helps me out a lot. And leave a rating, leave a review. And my next episode will be with Fernando Cervantes on his book Conquistadores. It will be coming out on the 5th of December, 2022. And we'll be talking about how we should think about the conquest of the Americas by the Spanish. And it's going to be a fascinating conversation. It's a wonderful book. And I can't wait for it. So that's all from me. I'm Ahilius.
And I'm Julia.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.